Planet of the Apes. This is one of the longest running franchises in cinematic history. It's been going for the better part of 50 years, over 50 years, really, at this point. The very first Planet of the Apes movie came out in like 1968. So we're talking about 55 years in all actuality. And throughout the 70s, they released a lot of Planet of the Apes films. They released 5 all within about a 7 to 8 or 9 year time span. It was a pretty successful franchise, modestly successful at that particular time, but they were exploring some very, very heavy science fiction topics. The franchise went to rest for a while. They had a remake in 2001 from Tim Burton. Financially, it did great, but critically, it didn't do so well. And so they rebooted the franchise once again in 2011 with Rise of the Planet of the Apes, and then ultimately had 2 sequels after that. The 2 sequels that probably get the most critical reception are the ones from Matt Reeves, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and War for the Planet of the Apes. And so they've pumped out so many movies and have reinvented the story quite often. And now here we are, about 7 years later after the most recent one with Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. This movie was officially announced a little bit under 2 years ago. It was sort of quietly in development. It didn't really have a lot of fanfare around it, but I remember the exact day I saw the announcement from 20th Century Studios and Walt Disney that they were going to make another one, and that Wes Ball indeed was directing. And Wes Ball has been mostly associated with the Maze Runner film series that he directed. And so now he's coming over to this new franchise and taking this story in a bit of a new direction, because it does take place after the trilogy that focused on Caesar. I think it's about 300 years after the events of War for the Planet of the Apes. And so we take a pretty big significant jump in the development of the story and where they're going to end up going. And there was also a bit of news that came out after the film was released that 20th Century Studios had made a plan to develop 9 new movies. And so we're about 4 movies deep into that 9 movie saga. We'll see if that actually happens. I have feelings about announcing things so far ahead of time, but this has been a really successful franchise in the 21st century. Those original, well, I shouldn't say original, but those recent 3 that came out from 2011 to 2017, all great box office successes. And so with all of that out the way, got a chance to check this out over the past few weeks as well. I will pass it over to you. What did you think about this new film, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes?
So Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, I was pretty excited about. I really do think that those first 3 movies are good. Especially what's the second one?
Dawn.
It's not War, is it? Dawn. Dawn. I think Dawn is like crazy. I think that movie is really good. But those are a really solid set of Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes movies, and the gap in between War and Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes had me worried in terms of, okay, will we all be interested in the story that they have to tell? And what you said at the beginning, that it being 300 years past what War was absolutely useful to this movie. I think Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes was and is another good entry into this franchise, and it contains so many different things while maintaining a lot of the same things that is needed, I think, for this movie to be successful. We're following new characters, we're following new protagonists, we're following now in this world there are so many different tribes of apes that exist, and they're able to have nuance for those tribes. This tribe over here specializes in this. This tribe over here specializes in that. I love that idea of world building. Of course, throughout time, different apes would have split off from the main Caesar group and become their own people. And I really like that idea. And Caesar in this world has become kind of a religious figure, right? He has become the Jesus of the apes. And so I really enjoy the mythology I think they've created in this in-between time, because in watching this film, there is still a lot of hints and things that do connect to the original, 1979, I think it was 1979 Planet of the Apes.
68, the
68,
original,
sorry, original 68. Sorry, I'm 10 years before that. 68, that's like still really cool to witness. I remember watching something happens in the movie and I pointed like, wait, is that from 68? Like it made me happy to see that. It wasn't over the top. It was something very subtle that let me know, though, that like, oh, y'all are still really trying to connect this thing. This isn't necessarily its own thing completely. And I thought that was a really cool thing to do. Not only that, the way it looks, I knew coming in, I was excited about like this has to be all apes. Like there's nothing else. This is going to be all apes. I was very excited to see how this movie would look, and they pulled it off again. I think this movie looks fantastic. The world is beautiful. Wes Ball, I think we're in good hands because this dude is about to come out here and direct the Legend of Zelda movie. I ain't gonna lie, there's a lot on his shoulders, but seeing this movie and the way he was able to build this world and the way it looked while I was watching it, I was like, this looks kind of like Breath of the Wild. Oh, this looks kind of like some Zelda stuff. And then remembering he's going to direct those movies made me happy to know that he was able to direct I think art in that way. I was like, it made me really excited for that. So there's a lot in this movie. There's a lot of politics and social commentary in this film that I actually really like, that I think it is interesting to talk about, that again remains the DNA of these films. Is like, okay, what are we saying? What are we saying about society? What are we saying about in these particular situations in which they're in? That what is the human behavior versus the ape behavior? All of that comes together and I think makes a really fun story about a character who's trying to Loki just kind of trying to get revenge on his own tribe himself. But yeah, the only thing towards the end, some things start to become predictable. They do some really good setup, and the setup is good. But I think a lot of us knew like exactly what was going to happen by the end of the film, and that took away from it a little bit for me. I was like, "Yep, I know what's going to happen there. Yep, I'm sure that'll happen." And so yeah, that stuff was fine. But overall, man, I enjoyed myself. I thought this was a very well crafted movie. I'm excited for West Ball again for what he can bring to Zelda. But I think this is another well respected, really good part of this franchise. I think they did a good job overall.
So 7 years since the last one. It seemed like that they put a pretty nice bow on the story of Caesar with the end of War for the Planet of the Apes, which concluded his story. And Matt Reeves obviously stepped away from the franchise to ultimately direct the Batman. I didn't know that they would greenlight another movie so quickly, but if their intention was truly to make a 9-film saga, then this all certainly fits in with their larger plans to really make this a long-standing, long-running new iteration of this franchise, which I can't totally be mad at, just because the Planet of the Apes franchise has been consistently reliable for the most part. You know, even that 2001 movie, the Tim Burton directed one, not a great movie by any stretch of the imagination, but it was hugely popular when it came out. People were super
It
excited for
was.
that movie. I remember that wholeheartedly. I remember seeing it in theaters and, walking away as a kid, not really understanding exactly what was going
I was
on,
lost as
but
hell in that movie.
it was a little confusing because I hadn't really engaged with the original films up until that point yet. But overall, this has been a very, very steady franchise from not only just an interest level standpoint, but I also think to a storytelling standpoint. Those original Planet of the Apes films from 68 all the way through the 70s all have really, really interesting ideas, and they gradually have their ebbs and flows, but I enjoy all of them for the most part. And then coming into this new 21st century telling of the story and reinventing it for a new audience, they've done some phenomenal work from a technological standpoint with the CGI to the performance capture, and then ultimately just really, really blowing out this world and I think enveloping us into the transition from a human run world ultimately until we get to the place of an ape run world. And they're taking their time, their sweet time,
Mm-hmm.
to get us to that place. But I'm not mad at that, because something like this, if it were to really happen, which we can't rule out the possibility that this could happen, it would take generations. It would take a millennia probably to get to the place where apes have overcome human beings to become the dominant species on planet Earth. And so taking place 300 years after what Caesar accomplished and what he really kickstarted was a smart decision, because you remove yourself from that storytelling, from the connections to that particular thread of stories, and then you also kind of hit a bit of a fresh reset and provide us with a new protagonist in Noah, who is a little bit more meek, I think, than Caesar was, a little bit less ambitious at this
Mm-hmm.
particular point, but it obviously will showcase his ambition, I'm sure, and his leadership capabilities will grow throughout the course of future films. And I found him to be pretty endearing at some points. Other points, I'm like, you're a little annoying. I can deal with you, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't totally buy you as this charismatic leader that's ultimately going to lead this new generation of apes into the next generation. But there's still a lot of time to develop and flesh out his character. But a lot of the pieces that are around him, I really, really enjoyed. I loved what Kevin Durant brought as Proximus Caesar. He was incredible in
Yes.
this movie. He's not in it a ton. We don't see him for a bit until we get really until deep into the second act. But when he shows up, I love what he did here, and I love just all of the implications of how he came into power and how he does worship the idea of Caesar and the message of Caesar. But
Mm-hmm.
it just, is a testament and reinforcing the idea of how agendas and how we perceive leaders and historical figures, they evolve and change over
Exactly.
time because we
Mm-hmm.
weren't there when they were in existence, when they really ruled. And so people kind of take their ideas and their plans and they contort them into their own meanings and make them what they want to be. And that's how you manipulate people. That's how you get people in power who know how to lead and get followers behind them because they know how to really craft a message to their own ideas, to their own vision, even if it wasn't necessarily true. And I like that that idea was sort of the central, sort of crux of the film and the conflict of the film. And then I also want to shout out the character of Raka, the orangutan in the movie, who's like an ally of Noah. Great character. I hate what they did
Absolutely.
with him, but a great
Yeah.
character in the film, and I love
Mm-hmm.
just the humor and the levity that he brought early on in the movie. I will say, on the opposite side of that, the human characters at this point do nothing for me. There's not really much there that I'm interested in from that standpoint, which I do think is interesting because in those, first three that came out in 2011, 2017, and or excuse me, 2011, 2014, and 2017, the human characters weren't the focus, but there were still some interesting elements about them. Like you had
Mm-hmm.
Gary Oldman, you had Jason Clarke, you had people where I was like, oh, I like these actors and I like them in this franchise. Here, I don't quite feel that way. And I think by the end of the movie, it's interesting because it feels like that there might be a shift in focus in terms of the
Yeah, I thought
story.
about that too.
And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and maybe it's a little bit more of a duality as opposed to completely pivoting the perspective of the
Mm-hmm.
story. I think that that's probably the way that they'll go. But I'm a little concerned about the future movies as it relates to that. But they don't take away from too much of my detractment and my enjoyment of the movie. And the last thing that I'll say, I guess, just in terms of a bit of a nitpick, the CGI for these films have always been incredible, but I do feel like that this is a step down from what they've achieved in the
Mm-hmm.
past. It doesn't look as good as War for the Planet of the Apes. Like I remember distinctly
Mm-hmm.
when that movie came out and you see some of those close-up shots of Caesar and the other apes in that movie. I mean, they are hyper realistic. They look ridiculously real. It's almost frightening how great the CGI had gotten to that point. And I don't feel like that there was any real moment in this movie that I felt the way that I felt watching War for the Planet of the Apes. Don't get
Mm-hmm.
me wrong, it's still great stuff. It's still some of the best CG you'll see in any big budget movie, but it does feel like that they got somewhat worse, and maybe that's just due to the state of the industry. We've talked a lot about that, just about the massive amount of work that's to go around, and just the increased production of CG technology in most films. But I just don't feel like that they hit any of the highs that we saw in the recent entry. But that's a
Mm-hmm.
nitpick again. It still looks great. It still has some really really cool looking action sequences and ultimately the actual kingdom in this movie, that particular set piece, that particular production design, extraordinary. I love
Really
that
cool.
they had a ship and
Mm-hmm.
it was on an ocean side on a beach, and I just loved it. And I love that we spent the majority of the second half of the movie there. So a lot to love and a lot to really make me interested about what they'll do in the future and how this will continue to progress and evolve in the future sort of years that the story takes place over the course of the next few movies that'll come out. I'm sure it's going to get another sequel. It's not doing the greatest necessarily at the box office. It's doing okay, but it does feel like a franchise that Disney and 20th Century Studios is completely invested in. So I'm pretty sure that they will come back with another one, and we'll certainly be on the lookout for that whenever it does go into production and ultimately come out. But folks, those are all of our thoughts on Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. If you've checked this movie out, definitely hit us up and let us know what you think.